Now we've really done it. We're finished with reconstruction. Hooray! But we want to go through it one more time in a detailed example to show how all the different stages fit together. And which example are we going to pick? Well, if you've been in the course this far, I bet you can guess. Robert Redford again. We're going to look at paragraph 3 of his article and go through reconstruction to show that reconstruction gives you an even deeper understanding than when we first went through it using close analysis alone. Reconstruction begins with close analysis, so the first thing I'll do is read through the passage and mark the important words in order to do a close analysis of Redford's paragraph. The BLM says its hands are tied. Remember, the BLM is the Bureau of Land Management. Why? Because is a premise marker. It's indicating that the sentence after it is a premise for the conclusion that the BLM's hands are tied. Because these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. You could say that valid and rights are evaluative terms, but that's not going to matter to our analysis here. And Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Now notice we've got a tricky argument marker here, gives it, because the point of that sentence is that it's the lease that explains why it has the right to drill or justifies the claim that it does have the right to drill. So gives it is an argument marker, and in particular, it has the right to drill as the conclusion, so it's a conclusion marker. Sure, Conoco has a lease. Sure is going to be an assuring term. More than one, in fact. In fact is another assuring term. But is going to be a discounting term, indicating that there's an objection being responded to. Those leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. Now you could think that originally is a guarding term because it's not saying that there never was sufficient environmental input, that is, environmental study or public input. It might have come later, just not originally, but again, that's not going to play any part in the argument itself. So it could be a guarding term, but you can mark it if you want. But as a result, the first 3 words of the next sentence, that's clearly an argument marker, and it's indicating that the sentence after it is a conclusion, so it's a conclusion marker. None of them conveyed a valid right to drill. What's more, now we're indicating there's a separate argument, there's a new premise coming, another reason for the same conclusion. In deciding to issue a permit to drill right now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling in these incomparable lands, but discounting, right? Instead determined that there would be no significant environmental harm on the basis of, this is telling you how they reached that determination, it was an abbreviated review. They had an abbreviated review that justified or explained their determination. So that's a premise marker. It didn't even look, even is a tricky one. It's discounting an objection. It's saying, well, they looked a little bit, but they didn't look at this. Discounting the objection that they did look at least some. They didn't even look at drilling on the other federal leases. Okay? Sounds like clearly a guarding term. It's not saying it is, but it sounds like Washington doublespeak. Doublespeak is bad. You don't want to doublespeak. To me, and maybe to me is another guarding term in the sense that it sounds that way to me but not to others. So we could mark that as a guard as well. So we have finished stage 1 of reconstructing this argument. We've done a close analysis. The next stage is to get rid of all the excess verbiage. So we'll start a new screen and do that. The BLM says its hands are tied. Well, the claim is that its hands are tied, so we can get rid of the fact that the BLM says that. Why? Because we can get rid of those words because they're going to get replaced by a dot pyramid in standard form. These lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. Good. And Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Good. And we can get rid of, because we're going to have two separate premises there. That gives it, right? Well, that's going to be an argument marker, as we saw. That's going to get replaced by another dot pyramid. Sure, Conoco has a lease. More than one, in fact. Now notice there, Redford is admitting what his opponent claims, but that's not going to be part of his argument. He's just saying, I recognize that. His arguments can be based on different claims, so we can get rid of, sure, Conoco has a lease, more than one in fact, and the but tells you that he's just answering an objection. These leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or input. That's going to be an important premise. As a result, we saw that was an argument marker, going to be replaced by a dot pyramid like the others. None of them conveyed a valid right to drill. What's more, another argument marker, so it's going to get replaced by a dot pyramid. In deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis, blah, 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 but instead, that's going to be discounting terms, and that's going to be important for understanding what the sentences are doing, but it's not going to get repeated in the premise when we put it in standard form. They determined there would be no significant impact on the basis of an abbreviated review that didn't even look at drilling on the other federal leases. The next step is to take all the parts that weren't crossed out, they're going to be the explicit premises and conclusion in the argument, and put them into standard form. And if you think about this paragraph, there are really two arguments, because at the start, what Redford tries to do is to state what the BLM's argument was to begin with, and then he gives his own argument against what the BLM says. So the BLM's argument can be put in standard form like this. First premise, Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Second premise, these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. And those two premises lead to the conclusion that the BLM's hands are tied. Now that's the BLM's argument that Redford is arguing against. Redford's own argument on the other side starts with the premise, those leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. Second premise, in deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands, but instead determined there would be no significant environmental harm on the basis of an abbreviated review that didn't even look at drilling on other federal leases. Those two premises lead to the conclusion that none of these conveyed a valid right to drill. And then there's another premise, these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights, and that's supposed to lead the conclusion this is Washington doublespeak. Well, we'll have to see what all that means when we clarify, but that's basically the standard form. It might be a good idea to double check, because you want to make sure that every sentence you didn't cross out is somewhere there in the standard form. So let's look back at the passage where we crossed out the excess and make sure everything's there in the standard form. Okay, it's all there.